Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug that was supposed to clear your sinuses but ended up clearing out entire generations instead. Imagine this. A pharmaceutical company creates an inhaler for stuffy noses, and within months, people across America are cracking these things open like Easter eggs, swallowing the medication-soaked strips inside and staying awake for 3 days straight. The irony? The drug worked exactly as designed. It just turned out that unlimited focus, boundless energy, and zero appetite made for perfect addiction bait. One small pill transformed straight-A students into paranoid insomniacs who couldn't remember their own names. Welcome to the amphetamine story, where the cure became infinitely worse than any disease it ever treated. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. To understand how one focus pill destroyed millions of lives, you first need to understand that nobody set out to create the perfect addiction machine. Romanian chemist Lazar Edeleanu synthesized amphetamine in 1887 at the University of Berlin, purely as an academic exercise. He created the compound, documented its structure, published his findings and moved on. The molecule sat ignored in chemistry journals for 42 years. Nobody cared. Nobody saw potential. The compound existed in a kind of pharmaceutical limbo, waiting for someone to realize what it could do to the human brain. That someone arrived in 1929. Gordon Alice, an American chemist working in Los Angeles, was hunting for asthma treatments. Alice had a methodical approach: synthesize compounds, test them on animals, observe the effects. Amphetamine appeared promising because it constricted blood vessels and opened airways. Alice decided to test it on himself, as chemists did in that gloriously reckless era of science. He injected 50 milligrams into his own arm. The effects hit within minutes. His heart rate spiked. Breathing became effortless. Fatigue vanished like someone had flipped a switch in his brain. But the real revelation came in the hours that followed. Alice felt invincible, focused, capable of intellectual feats that normally exhausted him. He worked through the night without rest, his mind racing through problems with crystalline clarity. The experience lasted 14 hours. When it finally faded, Alice knew he'd discovered something far more powerful than an asthma treatment. Here's what amphetamine actually does to your brain, stripped of medical jargon. Your neurons communicate using chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. Dopamine handles pleasure and motivation. Norepinephrine manages alertness and focus. Normally, your brain releases these chemicals in controlled bursts, then quickly reabsorbs them to maintain balance. Amphetamine breaks this entire system. The drug forces your neurons to dump dopamine and norepinephrine in massive quantities, while simultaneously blocking reabsorption. Imagine your brain's reward system as a nightclub with a strict capacity limit. Amphetamine kicks down the doors, floods the place with 1,000 people, then chains the exits shut. The party never stops. Your brain drowns in its own feel-good chemicals. The physical effects follow predictably. Appetite disappears because your hypothalamus gets overwhelmed with signals indicating satisfaction. Sleep becomes impossible because your arousal systems run at maximum capacity. Heart rate accelerates. Blood pressure climbs, body temperature rises, pupils dilate. You become a hyperactive, euphoric machine that doesn't need food or rest. At least that's how it feels for the first few hours. Alice published his findings in 1932, and pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline & French immediately saw commercial potential. They didn't market amphetamine as a stimulant or mood enhancer. That would invite regulatory scrutiny. Instead, they packaged it as Benzedrine, a decongestant inhaler for people with stuffy noses. The device looked harmless. a small tube containing a medication-soaked strip that users would crack open and inhale. The vapor cleared nasal passages effectively. Smith, Kline and French began selling Benzedrine inhalers in 1933 without requiring prescriptions. Anyone could walk into a drugstore and purchase unlimited quantities. Within months, the company noticed something unusual. Inhaler sales exploded beyond any reasonable demand for cold medication. People were buying dozens at a time. Drugstores couldn't keep them in stock. Smith, Kline and French investigated and discovered the truth. Users weren't inhaling the medication. They were dismantling the inhalers, removing the drug-soaked strips, and either swallowing them whole or boiling them in water to extract the amphetamine. Each inhaler contained 250 milligrams of the substance, enough for a substantial high. The demographics revealed an unexpected pattern. Medical students led the consumption surge. Young doctors in training discovered that swallowing a Benzedrine strip transformed them into studying machines. 24-hour study sessions became routine. Memorizing entire textbooks in single sittings felt effortless. The drug annihilated fatigue, sharpened concentration, and provided euphoric confidence that made even the most tedious material fascinating. Word spread through university campuses like an epidemic. Smith, Kline and French faced a choice: acknowledge the abuse and pull the product, or embrace the unintended market. They chose profit. The company began producing Benzedrine tablets in 1937, making the drug even easier to consume. They marketed these pills as treatment for narcolepsy, depression and obesity. Conditions broad enough to justify prescribing them to almost anyone. Doctors wrote prescriptions freely because the medical establishment viewed amphetamines as safe, non-addictive wonder drugs. The American Medical Association published articles praising Benzedrine's remarkable properties without mentioning addiction potential. The first casualties appeared quickly. Medical students who'd used Benzedrine to power through exams found themselves unable to study without it. The drug's effect diminished with repeated use, forcing users to increase doses. Tolerance developed within weeks. A student who started with one 10-milligram tablet would soon need 3, then 5, then 10 just to achieve the same focus. The escalation seemed reasonable at first, just a bit more to maintain performance. But amphetamine tolerance has no ceiling. Users chase an effect that becomes progressively harder to reach while their body accumulate damage. The withdrawal symptoms ensured continued use. Students who tried to quit experienced crushing depression, sleeping 16 hours daily, unable to concentrate on simple tasks. Their brains had adapted to artificial dopamine floods by reducing natural production and sensitivity. Without the drug, their reward systems barely functioned. Everything felt grey, pointless, impossible. Most users concluded they needed the medication to function normally, not recognizing that the drug had created the very deficit it now seemed to cure. Physical deterioration followed predictable patterns. Chronic users stopped eating because amphetamine obliterated appetite, losing dangerous amounts of weight. Sleep deprivation accumulated into complete exhaustion, crashes lasting days. Hearts strained under constant stimulation, with some young users developing arrhythmias typically seen in patients twice their age. Teeth deteriorated from grinding and dry mouth. Skin developed sores from obsessive picking during amphetamine-induced hallucinations. The hallucinations marked the point where recreational use became medical emergency. Students studying for finals would suddenly see shadow figures in their peripheral vision, or feel insects crawling under their skin, or become convinced their roommates were plotting against them. Amphetamine psychosis mimics paranoid schizophrenia perfectly. Users lose touch with reality while remaining functional enough to cause serious harm to themselves or others. University health centers began seeing students in crisis. brilliant minds reduced to paranoid wrecks, convinced that professors were poisoning them or that government agents monitored their thoughts. Smith, Klein, and French watched these disasters unfold and responded with strategic silence. The company funded research emphasizing amphetamine's benefits while burying studies documenting addiction and psychosis. They cultivated relationships with influential physicians who praised the drugs in medical journals. Marketing materials featured testimonials from satisfied users who'd lost weight or overcome depression, carefully omitting the thousands who'd lost their minds instead. By 1940, American pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing hundreds of millions of amphetamine tablets annually. The substances came in rainbow assortments: benzedrine, dexedrine, desoxin, each claiming unique benefits but all delivering the same addictive punch. Doctors prescribed them for conditions ranging from depression to obesity to simple fatigue. The pills became normalized, viewed as harmless helpers rather than dangerous drugs. Asking your doctor for some pep pills carried no more stigma than requesting aspirin. Nobody counted the casualties. Universities didn't track how many students dropped out due to amphetamine addiction. Hospitals didn't distinguish between natural psychosis and drug-induced paranoia. Families blamed mental illness when their children came home from college as paranoid insomniacs. The pharmaceutical industry had successfully created a drug epidemic while maintaining complete respectability. They'd taken a molecule that hijacked human brain chemistry and marketed it as medicine, then watched profits soar as millions became dependent. The truly diabolical aspect was timing. Benzedrine inhalers hit the market in 1933, right as America emerged from the Great Depression. The cultural narrative emphasized productivity, achievement, and success at any cost. Amphetamines fit perfectly into this worldview. Pills that made you work harder, study longer, accomplish more. The drugs promised to optimize human performance, and Americans eagerly swallowed that promise along with the pills. Nobody questioned whether optimization might have a price, or whether that price might be permanent. Harvard Medical School, full semester 1934. A third-year student named Richard, facing his pharmacology final, made a desperate calculation. He'd purchased a benzedrine inhaler for his chronic congestion 2 weeks earlier, and after accidentally taking too large a dose, he'd discovered its remarkable side effect: 12 straight hours of crystalline focus. The exam covered 800 pages of dense material. Richard had 72 hours to master content that should require 3 weeks. He cracked open 3 inhalers, extracted the medication strips, and swallowed them with black coffee. The studying session that followed became legend among his classmates. Richard absorbed the entire textbook in a single marathon, his brain processing information at speeds he'd never experienced. He took meticulous notes, cross-referenced concepts, memorized complex chemical structures with photographic clarity. When exam day arrived, he scored perfectly. His roommate noticed the empty benzedrine tubes and asked the obvious question. Richard shared his secret with 5 trusted friends. Within a month, half the medical school was cracking open inhalers before major exams. The pattern replicated across America's elite institutions with viral intensity. Yale students discovered that benzedrine transformed all-night study sessions from torture into competitive sport. Columbia pre-law students used the drug to power through case law analysis that typically took weeks. MIT engineering candidates calculated complex equations for days without rest. The academic arms race had begun. Students who didn't use amphetamines found themselves competing against peers whose brains operated in overdrive. Natural ability couldn't match chemical enhancement. Smith, Klein, and French noticed inhaler sales clustering around university towns and recognized opportunity. The company hired representatives to visit campus health centers, armed with free samples and literature emphasizing Benzedrine's benefits for concentration and mental stamina. They didn't market to students directly. That would appear predatory. Instead, they targeted university physicians who prescribed the tablets freely to anyone complaining of fatigue or difficulty studying. Campus pharmacies stocked bottles of 500 tablets that students purchased without questions. The drug's appeal transcended mere academic performance. Benzedrine made users feel invincible, socially confident, and intellectually superior. Shy students became charismatic at parties. Awkward laboratory researchers delivered brilliant presentations. The pills demolished social anxiety while amplifying every positive emotion. One tablet transformed ordinary evenings into adventures, mundane conversations into profound exchanges. Students began taking Benzedrine not just for studying, but for any situation where enhanced performance seemed desirable. This recreational use accelerated addiction timelines dramatically. Students who used amphetamines only during finals could sometimes escape dependency. Those who took pills weekly, then daily, then multiple times daily crossed into addiction within months. Their brains adapted to constant chemical stimulation by essentially shutting down normal dopamine production. Every natural source of pleasure, food, sex, friendship, achievement, became muted and disappointing compared to the pharmaceutical high. The first documented casualties emerged during spring semester 1936. A Johns Hopkins medical student named Patricia had maintained a perfect academic record using Benzedrine since her freshman year. By her senior year, she required 100 milligrams daily just to attend lectures. Her weight dropped from 140 to 98 pounds. She stopped sleeping entirely, convinced that rest was inefficient. During her final oral examination, Patricia experienced complete psychotic break. She accused her professors of conspiring to steal her research, then began screaming about insects infesting the examination room. Campus security escorted her to psychiatric care. She never completed her medical degree. Johns Hopkins administrators classified Patricia's breakdown as spontaneous mental illness and never mentioned amphetamines in official records. The university had no incentive to acknowledge that their star student's collapse resulted from drugs their own health center had prescribed. Word spread through unofficial channels anyway. Medical students across the country heard whispered warnings about Benzedrine psychosis, but most dismissed these as rare exceptions or exaggerations. The pills worked too well to abandon based on isolated incidents. More cases followed with increasing frequency. A Harvard student named James used Benzedrine to complete his dissertation in 2 weeks, an accomplishment that should have required 6 months. He submitted brilliant work, earned honours, then suffered complete cognitive collapse the following month. James couldn't remember basic information, struggled to form coherent sentences, and experienced paranoid delusions that his thesis committee planned to murder him. His family committed him to McLean Hospital, where doctors diagnosed schizophrenia. Nobody questioned whether chronic amphetamine use might cause symptoms identical to schizophrenia. Yale reported 3 student suicides during the 1937-1938 academic year, all involving young men who'd been using Benzedrine heavily. The deaths occurred during severe depressive episodes following extended amphetamine binges. Universities filed these tragedies under mental health crises without investigating pharmaceutical causes. Admitting that campus health centers distributed addictive drugs would invite lawsuits and regulatory intervention. Institutional self-preservation demanded silence. The physical deterioration patterns became recognizable to those paying attention. Heavy Benzedrine users developed a distinctive appearance: gaunt faces, hollow eyes, jerky movements, and obsessive behaviors. They picked at their skin constantly, creating sores that refused to heal. Their teeth ground down to nubs from jaw clenching. Hand tremors made fine motor tasks impossible. Some students developed heart palpitations so severe they collapsed during lectures. Campus health centers treated these symptoms individually, prescribing sleep aids, anti-anxiety medications, appetite stimulants, without addressing the amphetamine use causing everything. Smith, Klein, and French responded to growing concerns with a public relations masterpiece. The company commissioned studies from friendly researchers who concluded that Benzedrine was safe when used as directed. They published pamphlets explaining that addiction only occurred in individuals with weak character or predisposition to substance abuse. The marketing implied that responsible, intelligent students faced no risk, a message that elite university populations found especially appealing. Nobody wants to believe they lack the willpower to control drug use. The company introduced new formulations claiming improved safety profiles. Dexedrine hit the market in 1937 as a refined version of Benzedrine, supposedly delivering cleaner stimulation with fewer side effects. The chemical difference was minimal. Dexedrine contained only the right-handed amphetamine molecule, while Benzedrine contained both forms. But the marketing emphasized innovation and safety. Students switched to the new product, believing they'd eliminated addiction risk. The dependency patterns remained identical. Campus drug culture evolved its own rituals and terminology. Students called Benzedrine tablets bennies or peaches based on their orange color. They traded pills like currency, with street value increasing during exam periods. Elaborate myths developed about optimal dosing strategies. Taking pills with coffee supposedly enhanced effects, while eating protein supposedly prevented crashes. None of these folk remedies changed the fundamental reality that repeated amphetamine use caused irreversible brain changes. The academic performance benefits proved temporary for most users. Initial improvements in grades and productivity created powerful reinforcement. The pills worked exactly as promised. But tolerance developed relentlessly. Students found themselves taking larger doses for diminishing returns. Many discovered they couldn't study effectively without amphetamines anymore, not because the drug enhanced their abilities, but because withdrawal had destroyed their natural cognitive function. They'd become dependent on pills just to reach baseline performance. Some students recognized the trap and tried to quit. Withdrawal proved brutal beyond anything they'd anticipated. The depression felt existential. Not just sadness, but complete absence of joy or motivation. Sleep came in 16-hour blocks that left them more exhausted than before. Concentration became impossible. Reading a single paragraph required heroic effort. Most quit attempts failed within days. Users convinced themselves they needed the medication to function, unable to recognize that their dysfunction was withdrawal, not their natural state. The few who successfully quit faced months of cognitive impairment before their brains recovered baseline function. Even then, many never fully returned to their pre-amphetamine mental acuity. Chronic use had worn pathways in their neural circuitry that remained permanently altered. Some former users reported depression and focus problems years after their last dose, suggesting that extended amphetamine use caused lasting damage to dopamine systems. Universities documented none of this systematically. No institution tracked how many students used Benzedrine, how many became addicted, or how many suffered permanent consequences. The lack of official recognition allowed the problem to spread unchecked. By 1939, an estimated 30% of students at elite universities had used amphetamines for academic purposes. Perhaps 5% had progressed to full addiction. These numbers remained invisible because nobody wanted to count. Medical schools faced particularly bitter irony. institutions training future doctors distributed addictive drugs to their students while teaching courses on pharmacology and addiction. The cognitive dissonance went unaddressed. Medical students memorized amphetamine's mechanism of action, learned to recognize addiction symptoms, then swallowed their own pills to study for those very exams. Some rationalized this as practical education, understanding drugs through personal experience. Most simply ignored the contradiction. Smith, Klein and French celebrated record profits. The company's annual reports praised Benzedrine's success across multiple markets: diet pills for weight loss, pep pills for fatigue, study aids for students. Shareholders received generous dividends funded by America's growing amphetamine dependency. Company executives likely knew they'd created an addiction machine, but pharmaceutical profits have always depended on repeat customers. Amphetamines simply accelerated that business model to its logical extreme. The medical establishment maintained complicit silence. Journal articles continued praising amphetamine's therapeutic benefits, without adequately warning about addiction potential. Prominent physicians published testimonials about successfully treating thousands of patients with Benzedrine, carefully omitting how many of those patients became lifelong users unable to stop. The American Medical Association issued no warnings, established no prescription guidelines, and ignored mounting evidence that they'd unleashed an epidemic. By decade's end, the infrastructure for mass amphetamine addiction was firmly established. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured unlimited quantities. Doctors prescribed freely without monitoring. Universities looked away as their students deteriorated. The drugs had become normalized, integrated into American life as acceptable tools for enhancing performance. Everyone involved, pharmaceutical executives, physicians, university administrators, even users themselves, maintained collective denial about the obvious truth. They'd created a generation of addicts who would never escape. September 1939. Germany invaded Poland with an army running on pharmaceutical fuel. Temla Pharmaceutical Company had begun mass-producing Pervitin, their brand name for methamphetamine, the previous year, and Wehrmacht commanders immediately recognized its military applications. Soldiers who swallowed these tablets could march for days without sleep, fight through exhaustion that would cripple normal troops, and maintain aggressive focus during extended combat operations. The German military ordered 35 million Pervitin tablets in 1940 alone. Blitzkrieg wasn't just tactical innovation, it was chemically enhanced warfare. German tank crews received the highest doses. Panzer operations required crews to function continuously for 72 hours during rapid advances across France and Poland. Commanders distributed Pervitin tablets every 4 hours, keeping their soldiers wired and operational through conditions that would normally force rest. The strategy worked brilliantly for conquest, but created battalions of addicts. By 1941, German military doctors were documenting widespread dependency, psychotic breaks, and cardiovascular collapse among troops who'd been using methamphetamine continuously since invasion began. The Luftwaffe took it further. Bomber pilots flying night missions over Britain received mandatory Pervitin doses to maintain alertness during 10-hour flights. Fighter pilots used the drug to sharpen reaction times during dogfights. Some airmen developed such severe paranoia that they attacked their own squadrons, convinced that Allied aircraft had infiltrated German formations. Others experienced mid-flight hallucinations, seeing enemy planes that didn't exist, or mistaking landmarks for targets. The German Air Command attributed these incidents to combat stress rather than admit their entire air force operated while high. Japan's military embraced amphetamines with equal enthusiasm, but far less restraint. Pharmaceutical companies across Japan manufactured methamphetamine under various brand names, with Philippon becoming the most widely distributed. Japanese military culture emphasized total dedication and fearlessness in combat, qualities that methamphetamine enhanced artificially. Kamikaze pilots received massive doses before suicide missions, transforming terrified young men into euphoric weapons who flew directly into American ships. The drug didn't create courage, it obliterated the brain's capacity for self-preservation. Japanese ground troops in the Pacific Theater used amphetamines to function in brutal tropical conditions. Soldiers went days without food or sleep, fighting through jungles that would normally break human endurance. American forces encountering Japanese troops noted their seemingly superhuman resilience and willingness to fight to death rather than surrender. Intelligence reports attributed this to fanatical ideology. The reality involved industrial quantities of methamphetamine producing soldiers whose brains no longer processed normal fear or exhaustion signals. The United States watched its enemies deploy amphetamines and concluded that it needed matching chemical capabilities. The US military contracted with Smith, Kline and French to produce Benzedrine tablets in unprecedented quantities. Starting in 1942, American bomber crews received routine amphetamine doses before missions over Germany. The Army Air Force distributed 180 million tablets during the war years. Commanders viewed this as essential medicine, not recognizing they were creating addiction on industrial scale. American ground troops received Benzedrine tablets in their medical kits, alongside morphine and bandages. Officers encouraged use during combat operations, particularly during prolonged engagements where sleep deprivation threatened effectiveness. Soldiers discovered that amphetamines made fear manageable, transformed exhaustion into energy, and allowed them to function through trauma that would normally induce shutdown. Many used pills not just during combat but continuously, finding that the drug made military life bearable. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 demonstrated amphetamine's combat applications and catastrophic consequences simultaneously. US Marines assaulting the heavily fortified island took Benzedrine tablets before the invasion to maintain alertness during the grueling 76-hour battle. The drug kept them fighting through conditions of extraordinary violence and exhaustion, but several Marines experienced severe psychotic episodes during combat, attacking their own units or exhibiting reckless behavior that got them killed. Military brass classified these incidents as combat fatigue and continued distributing amphetamines without modification. British forces followed similar patterns. The Royal Air Force issued Benzedrine to bomber crews flying missions over occupied Europe. British commandos used the drug during extended operations behind enemy lines. The Ministry of Defense purchased millions of tablets from American pharmaceutical companies and distributed them across all service branches. British military doctors documented addiction problems as early as 1943 but faced pressure to remain silent. Acknowledging the issue would mean depriving troops of a tool commanders considered essential. The scale of military amphetamine use remained classified for decades. After the war, researchers estimated that American, British, German and Japanese forces collectively distributed over 200 million amphetamine tablets to their troops. This figure likely understates reality significantly, because many distribution records were destroyed or never properly documented. Entire divisions fought entire campaigns while chemically altered, their actions influenced by drugs that hijacked judgment, fear response, and self-preservation instincts. Victory celebrations in 1945 obscured an emerging disaster. Millions of soldiers returned home physically intact but neurologically destroyed. The veterans exhibited symptoms ranging from severe depression to violent paranoia to complete psychotic breaks. Military psychiatrists diagnosed these cases as battle fatigue or shell shock, psychological trauma from combat exposure. Nobody investigated how many of these cases actually represented amphetamine withdrawal or permanent brain damage from chronic stimulant use. The veteran addiction problem manifested differently than civilian dependency. Soldiers had taken amphetamines under orders as prescribed medication from military doctors. They associated the drugs with duty and survival rather than recreation. Many veterans genuinely believed they needed ongoing amphetamine use to function normally, unaware that their perceived deficits resulted from drug-induced brain changes rather than inherent problems. They sought prescriptions from civilian doctors who, recognizing the symptoms of depression and fatigue, readily prescribed the same stimulants. Veterans Administration hospitals became unwitting addiction treatment centers, though nobody acknowledged this role. Psychiatric wards filled with former soldiers experiencing amphetamine withdrawal symptoms, crushing depression, paranoid ideation, violent outbursts, suicidal thoughts. VA doctors treated these symptoms individually with various medications, but rarely addressed the underlying stimulant dependency. Many veterans remained on amphetamines for years or life, their prescriptions renewed automatically without evaluation. The suicide rate among World War II veterans spiked dramatically in the years immediately following demobilization. Official statistics attributed these deaths to combat trauma, and certainly many veterans suffered from genuine PTSD. But a significant percentage had never seen direct combat yet exhibited severe psychiatric symptoms consistent with amphetamine withdrawal and long-term stimulant damage. Their families buried them, believing war had broken their minds. The pharmaceutical dimension remained invisible. Smith, Klein, and French emerged from World War II as one of America's most profitable pharmaceutical companies. Military contracts had provided guaranteed revenue and established Benzedrine's reputation as a trusted, effective medication. The company leveraged this credibility in peacetime marketing, promoting amphetamines for civilian conditions ranging from depression to obesity to simple tiredness. Veterans appeared in advertisements, praising the same pills that had kept them operational during combat. Nobody mentioned that many of these testimonial givers were thoroughly addicted. German pharmaceutical companies faced a different post-war situation. The Allied occupation forces discovered Temmler's Pervitin production facilities and documentation revealing the massive scale of Wehrmacht methamphetamine distribution. This evidence remained classified. Publicizing it would require admitting that Allied forces had engaged in identical practices. Instead, occupation authorities shut down German amphetamine production, while American and British pharmaceutical companies filled the void in global markets. Japan's pharmaceutical industry suffered similar suppression. American occupation forces found warehouses containing millions of methamphetamine tablets manufactured for military distribution. General MacArthur's administration destroyed these stockpiles publicly, while privately allowing pharmaceutical companies to resume production for medical purposes within months. The Japanese civilian population, already exposed to amphetamines through military service, became a captive market for drugs that American companies were eager to sell. The war had normalized amphetamines globally, while creating millions of dependent users. Soldiers from every nation returned home with altered brain chemistry and continued need for stimulants. Pharmaceutical companies possessed infrastructure capable of producing unlimited quantities. Governments had demonstrated willingness to purchase and distribute these drugs to their citizens. The civilian amphetamine epidemic that followed wasn't accidental. World War II had constructed the perfect conditions for it. Military medical records from the era reveal a darker reality that remained classified until the 1970s. Hundreds of soldiers died from amphetamine-related complications during the war. Heart attacks in men under 25, strokes in healthy soldiers, deaths from hypothermia during combat in hot climates. These deaths were attributed to combat stress or natural causes. Commanders who had distributed the drugs bore no responsibility. Pharmaceutical companies faced no liability. The victims' families never learned the truth. Perhaps most cynically, governments learned exactly the wrong lesson from wartime amphetamine use. Military strategists concluded that chemical enhancement provided competitive advantage in future conflicts. Rather than recognizing the catastrophic addiction and mental health consequences, they viewed amphetamines as successful force multipliers that should be refined and expanded. This thinking would shape military pharmaceutical use for decades, ensuring that each new generation of soldiers would face the same chemical roulette as their World War II predecessors. The pharmaceutical companies had achieved something remarkable. They'd convinced multiple governments to administer addictive drugs to millions of young men, creating a customer base that would require their products potentially for life. The war had been the ultimate marketing campaign, establishing amphetamines as patriotic, necessary and safe. Veterans returning home didn't think they had drug problems. They thought they had medical conditions requiring ongoing treatment. The distinction meant everything for pharmaceutical profit margins. By 1946, the infrastructure for industrial-scale amphetamine addiction was complete. Pharmaceutical companies could manufacture unlimited quantities. Doctors would prescribe without suspicion. Patients would take pills without recognizing addiction. Governments would remain silent to avoid acknowledging their role in creating the crisis. The next phase would target a demographic even more vulnerable than soldiers. American housewives convinced that pills could deliver the perfect life. The war ended, but amphetamine production accelerated. Smith, Kline, and French faced a problem. Military contracts had dried up overnight, leaving factories capable of producing billions of tablets with no buyer. The company's market research division identified a solution in 1946. American women, particularly suburban housewives, represented an untapped demographic numbering in the tens of millions. These women faced pressures that pharmaceutical marketing could exploit. Expectations to maintain perfect homes, raise perfect children, and remain perpetually attractive while receiving minimal social support. Amphetamines could be rebranded as the chemical solution to feminine inadequacy. The marketing campaign began with diet pills. Post-war American culture worshipped thinness, and pharmaceutical companies recognized that nearly every woman could be convinced she needed to lose weight. Dexedrine became the first amphetamine explicitly marketed for weight loss in 1947. Magazine advertisements featured slim models crediting the drug for their figures. The pitch was elegant. Take one small pill daily. Watch pounds disappear effortlessly. Doctors prescribed Dexedrine for any woman who mentioned weight concerns, which meant essentially every woman who walked into an examination room. The amphetamines worked exactly as advertised for the first few weeks. Appetite vanished completely. Food became uninteresting, even repulsive. Women dropped 10 pounds in the first month without effort or hunger. The weight loss felt miraculous, addictive in itself, visual proof that the pills delivered results. Most users attributed their success to willpower, rather than recognizing they were taking powerful stimulants that suppressed all natural hunger signals. But the drugs did far more than eliminate appetite. Housewives taking Dexedrine discovered they could clean their entire home in 3 hours, organize closets they'd ignored for years, complete all shopping and errands in a single hyper-efficient morning. The pills transformed tedious domestic labor into satisfying projects. Women felt energized, capable, even euphoric about tasks that normally felt like drudgery. Many reported feeling genuinely happy for the first time since marriage or childbirth. This combination of weight loss and enhanced productivity made the pills irresistible. Word spread through social networks with viral intensity. Women shared diet pill success stories at church meetings, school functions, and neighborhood gatherings. Doctors reported that patients began explicitly requesting Dexedrine by name, having heard recommendations from friends. By 1950, an estimated 2 million American women were taking prescription amphetamines regularly, most believing they were simply using diet aids. Pharmaceutical companies introduced new formulations targeting specific feminine concerns. Obertrol combined amphetamine with vitamins, marketed as a comprehensive wellness solution. Desoxin promised faster weight loss through methamphetamine, though advertisements avoided that terminology. Biphetamine offered extended-release formulations that kept users stimulated for 12 hours. Each product claimed unique benefits, but all delivered the same addictive stimulation under different branding. The advertising campaigns became increasingly sophisticated and predatory. Magazine spreads showed exhausted mothers transforming into energetic homemakers after taking their pills. Copy emphasized that modern women deserved pharmaceutical help managing their complex lives. One particularly effective campaign featured testimonials from nurses and teachers, professional women whose endorsement suggested medical legitimacy. Nobody mentioned these testimonial givers were selected specifically because they'd become dependent on the products. Doctors prescribed amphetamines with stunning casualness. A woman could visit her physician complaining of fatigue, mild depression, or desire to lose 5 pounds and walk out with a prescription for hundreds of tablets. The typical appointment lasted under 5 minutes. Doctors rarely inquired about previous drug use, monitored ongoing consumption, or warned about addiction potential. Many physicians genuinely believed amphetamines were safe. Pharmaceutical representatives had convinced them through carefully curated research and expensive lunches. The scale of prescribing accelerated throughout the 1950s. By 1958, American pharmaceutical companies manufactured 8 billion amphetamine tablets annually. Population was 175 million, meaning production averaged 46 pills per person per year, infants and elderly included. The actual consumption concentrated heavily among adult women, particularly suburban housewives aged 25 to 45. In this demographic, perhaps 1 in 4 women was taking prescription amphetamines regularly. The reality behind these statistics was devastating. A housewife named Margaret in Cleveland began taking Dexedrine in 1953 to lose 15 pounds before her high school reunion. She achieved her weight goal within 2 months, but discovered she couldn't stop the medication without becoming unbearably depressed. Margaret increased her dose to maintain the euphoric energy she'd grown to depend on. Within a year, she was taking 10 times her original prescription, obtained by visiting multiple doctors who never communicated with each other. Margaret's family watched her deteriorate over 18 months. She stopped eating almost entirely, her weight dropping to 90 pounds. Sleep became impossible. She cleaned the house obsessively at 3 a.m, scrubbing floors until her hands bled. Her children found her sitting motionless in darkened rooms, convinced that neighbours were plotting against her. Margaret's husband committed her to psychiatric care in 1955. Doctors diagnosed schizophrenia and never investigated the Dexedrine bottles hidden throughout her home. This pattern repeated across America thousands of times with minor variations. A suburban mother in Los Angeles used Obertrol to manage her household and 3 children. The pills worked perfectly for 6 months until tolerance forced escalating doses. She began experiencing paranoid delusions that her husband was having affairs, that her children were being poisoned at school, that the television was broadcasting messages specifically to her. Her family found her one morning arranging kitchen knives in geometric patterns, explaining that the configuration would protect them from government surveillance. Commitment to psychiatric care followed within days. The physical deterioration proved equally catastrophic. Women who'd been vibrant and healthy at 30 became skeletal, trembling wrecks at 35. Teeth rotted from constant grinding and stimulant-induced dry mouth. Skin developed sores from obsessive picking. Hearts developed arrhythmias from years of chemical stimulation. Many users looked 20 years older than their actual age, the drugs aging them with brutal efficiency. Children grew up watching their mother's pharmaceutical destruction. A generation of kids learned that mommy needed her pills to function, that the bottles in the medicine cabinet were more important than meals or bedtime stories. Some children later recalled their mothers spending hours rearranging furniture or organizing drawers while they played unsupervised. Others remembered their mothers becoming paranoid and volatile, screaming about imagined threats or locking themselves in bedrooms for days. The divorce rate among amphetamine-using housewives spiked dramatically. Husbands returned from work to find their wives manic, paranoid, or catatonic with depression. The pills amplified every emotional response while destroying judgment and impulse control. Arguments escalated into violence. Women accused their spouses of elaborate conspiracies. Marriages that had been stable for years collapsed within months once amphetamine addiction took hold. Courts routinely awarded custody to fathers based on mothers' psychiatric symptoms, never recognizing these symptoms as drug-induced. Some women recognized the trap and sought help. The medical establishment offered essentially nothing. Doctors who'd prescribed amphetamines freely now dismissed concerns about dependency, insisting the drugs were non-addictive when used properly. If women persisted in complaints, physicians prescribed additional medications to manage the symptoms: sleeping pills for insomnia, tranquilizers for anxiety, antidepressants for the crushing lows. This polypharmacy approach created layers of dependency without addressing the underlying amphetamine addiction. Withdrawal attempts failed with depressing consistency. Women who tried to quit experienced depression so severe they could barely function. Everything felt impossible: getting out of bed, preparing food, caring for children. The exhaustion was total, overwhelming, unrelenting. Most gave up within days, concluding they had medical conditions requiring ongoing treatment. This was precisely the narrative pharmaceutical companies had cultivated. The drugs weren't causing problems, they were treating underlying deficiencies. The few women who successfully quit faced months of disability before their brains recovered even partial function. Depression persisted for a year or longer. Many never fully regained their pre-amphetamine mental acuity or emotional range. Chronic use had carved pathways in their neural architecture that remained permanently altered. Some former users reported that even decades later, they experienced occasional cravings or mood disturbances traced back to their years on diet pills. Pharmaceutical companies tracked these outcomes through their own research departments and maintained strategic silence. Internal documents from this era, released decades later through litigation, reveal that executives knew their products caused severe addiction. They knew women were experiencing psychotic breaks, marriages were being destroyed, and children were being traumatized. The documents also show that companies deliberately suppressed this information while expanding marketing efforts. Profits depended on maintaining the illusion of safety. SmithKline and French introduced Dexamyl in 1950, combining amphetamine with barbiturates. The marketing genius was diabolical. The amphetamine provided energy and weight loss, while the barbiturate reduced the jittery side effects and helped users sleep. This combination created even stronger dependency, because users became addicted to two drug classes simultaneously. Dexamyl became wildly popular among housewives who appreciated the balanced effects. Nobody warned them that withdrawal from this combination could cause seizures and death. The medical journals published exactly what pharmaceutical companies wanted: Studies emphasized amphetamine's benefits for weight loss and depression, while minimizing addiction concerns. Researchers who attempted to publish findings documenting severe dependency problems found their work rejected by major journals that relied on pharmaceutical advertising revenue. The scientific literature became effectively a marketing arm for drug companies, presenting biased research as objective medicine. Some doctors began recognizing the catastrophe unfolding in their practices. Women who'd been healthy 5 years earlier now exhibited profound psychiatric symptoms and physical deterioration. But speaking publicly about amphetamine dangers meant admitting they'd been prescribing addictive drugs carelessly for years. Professional self-preservation encouraged silence. Most doctors simply stopped prescribing amphetamines to new patients, while continuing to supply existing users, reasoning that withdrawal would be more dangerous than maintenance. The housewife amphetamine epidemic reached its peak around 1958. An estimated 5 million American women were taking prescription stimulants regularly. Perhaps 1 million had progressed to full addiction, their lives controlled by pills they'd been told were safe. Countless marriages had been destroyed, children traumatized, women committed to psychiatric institutions or permanently damaged. The pharmaceutical industry celebrated record profits while the human cost remained invisible in official statistics. The cultural narrative surrounding these drugs prevented honest recognition of the disaster. Society viewed amphetamines as legitimate medicine prescribed by trusted doctors. Women using diet pills weren't drug addicts. They were responsible mothers managing their health and appearance. This distinction allowed the epidemic to continue unchecked. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that suburban America was experiencing mass pharmaceutical addiction, because doing so would implicate doctors, drug companies, and the women themselves. By decade's end, the infrastructure of denial was complete. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured pills in unlimited quantities. Doctors prescribed reflexively without monitoring. Women took tablets daily without recognizing dependency. Families blamed mental illness when their wives and mothers deteriorated. The system functioned perfectly to obscure cause and effect, ensuring that each generation of women would discover amphetamines anew and repeat the cycle. The housewife epidemic would continue for another decade before regulators finally acknowledged what had been obvious for years. They'd allowed pharmaceutical companies to addict millions of American women for profit. The 1960s brought a new generation of students who had no memory of benzodrine's earlier destruction. Universities that had quietly dealt with amphetamine casualties in the 1930s now faced larger enrollments, increased academic pressure, and pharmaceutical companies that had perfected their marketing strategies. Smith, Klein, and French deployed representatives to campus health centers with updated materials emphasizing amphetamines as safety for students experiencing academic stress disorder, a condition the company had essentially invented. The pitch to university physicians was elegant. Helping students succeed academically served everyone's interests, and modern amphetamines were refined, controlled, and far safer than the crude formulations of previous decades. Berkeley's campus health center became an early testing ground for this strategy in 1962. A pharmaceutical representative convinced the center's medical director that students struggling with coursework suffered from undiagnosed attention deficits requiring stimulant treatment. The director implemented a policy where any student complaining of concentration difficulties received automatic dexedrine prescriptions. Within 6 months, over 800 students were picking up monthly refills. The campus pharmacy couldn't stock bottles fast enough to meet demand. The distribution system was beautifully efficient from a pharmaceutical perspective. Students would schedule brief appointments complaining of focus problems or fatigue. Physicians asked minimal questions. Confirming symptoms took perhaps 90 seconds. Prescriptions were written for 60 or 90 tablets with multiple refills. The entire process consumed less than 5 minutes per student. Campus health centres became de facto amphetamine distribution points, processing hundreds of students weekly without meaningful oversight or follow-up. Stanford's engineering program saw similar patterns emerge in 1963. The curriculum's notorious difficulty created intense pressure, and word spread quickly that certain pills could transform struggling students into academic machines. An electrical engineering student named David obtained a Dexedrine prescription by telling the campus doctor he felt mentally foggy. The medication allowed him to complete a semester-long circuit design project in 3 weeks. His work was brilliant, innovative, and earned faculty praise. 12 classmates asked David for his secret. He directed them to the health centre with the exact symptoms to report. The academic results initially appeared miraculous. Students who'd been barely passing suddenly earned top grades. Complex mathematics that had seemed incomprehensible became manageable. Programming assignments that required days of work were completed in single marathon sessions. Professors noticed the improved performance and attributed it to students finally applying themselves properly. Nobody questioned why so many students suddenly began visiting campus health centres before midterms and finals. But the tolerance patterns emerged within months. David's initial 10 mg dose stopped working after 6 weeks. He returned to the health centre requesting stronger medication, and the doctor increased his prescription to 20 mg without examination. This pattern repeated every few months. Within a year, David was taking 60 mg daily just to maintain baseline concentration. His weight had dropped from 170 to 135 pounds. He developed a tremor in his hands that made soldering circuit boards difficult. The psychological effects intensified with escalating doses. Students taking high amounts of amphetamines began exhibiting paranoid behaviours that their peers initially dismissed as stress. A physics major at Caltech became convinced that his research partner was sabotaging his experiments. A chemistry student at MIT locked herself in the laboratory for 3 days, refusing to leave because she believed the equipment was communicating messages through electromagnetic radiation. These incidents were treated as isolated mental breakdowns rather than recognizing the common pharmaceutical thread. The crashes hit suddenly and devastatingly. Students who'd functioned brilliantly while medicated would stop taking pills, either running out of prescriptions or attempting to quit, and collapse into depression within 48 hours. The contrast was brutal. From Superman to barely functional in 2 days. Many users concluded they suffered from severe underlying depression, requiring ongoing treatment, never connecting their symptoms to amphetamine withdrawal. They returned to health centres for refills, and doctors obliged without questioning whether the medication itself had created the dependency. Harvard reported its first confirmed amphetamine-related suicide in spring 1965. A sophomore named Michael had used Dexedrine heavily throughout his freshman year, earning exceptional grades while sleeping 3 hours nightly. During summer break, away from easy campus access to prescriptions, Michael experienced severe withdrawal. He became increasingly depressed, isolated himself from family and friends, and hanged himself in his bedroom 8 weeks after his last dose. The suicide note mentioned feeling permanently broken and unable to think clearly. His family had no idea he'd been taking amphetamines and attributed his death to academic pressure. Universities recognized they faced a growing problem but responded with public relations rather than intervention. Campus newspapers were discouraged from reporting amphetamine-related incidents. Health centers received instructions to be discreet about stimulant prescriptions. When students died or suffered psychiatric breaks, official statements emphasized mental health crises without mentioning pharmaceuticals. The institutional priority was protecting reputation rather than protecting students. MIT experienced a particularly devastating case in 1966. A senior named Lisa had maintained a perfect GPA through 4 years of electrical engineering using amphetamines obtained from campus health services. She'd been taking 80 milligrams daily for 2 years, functioning brilliantly while her brain chemistry underwent catastrophic alteration. During finals week of her senior year, Lisa experienced complete amphetamine psychosis while in the library. She began screaming that the books contained coded messages from Soviet agents, then attacked other students she believed were conspirators. Campus police restrained her after she tried to jump from a third-floor window to escape surveillance. Lisa was committed to McLean Hospital, the same psychiatric institution that had treated amphetamine casualties in the 1930s. Doctors there had seen this pattern countless times, but couldn't officially acknowledge it without implicating the entire medical establishment. They diagnosed Lisa with acute schizophrenia and never mentioned the amphetamines in her medical records. She spent 6 months in psychiatric care, missed her graduation, and lost her job offer at Bell Labs. Her family believed she'd suffered spontaneous mental illness. MIT's administration never informed them about her years of campus health center prescriptions. The student-to-student distribution networks emerged as health centers began marginally restricting prescriptions. Students with legitimate prescriptions realized they could sell individual tablets for premium prices during exam periods. A single Dexedrine tablet that cost pennies from the pharmacy sold for $3 to $5 to desperate classmates. Some students with prescriptions became dealers, visiting multiple doctors to accumulate supplies they never personally consumed. This underground market operated openly in dormitories and fraternity houses, while administrators maintained willful ignorance. Chemistry and pharmacy students recognized an even more lucrative opportunity. The synthesis of amphetamines required relatively simple procedures and commonly available precursor chemicals. A graduate student at UC Berkeley began manufacturing methamphetamine in a campus laboratory after hours, using equipment and materials intended for legitimate research. His product was purer and cheaper than pharmaceutical versions. Within months, he was supplying dozens of students and earning more from drug sales than his teaching assistant stipend. University officials only discovered the operation after a small explosion damaged the laboratory. The student had been working while high on his own product. Stanford reported a death that should have triggered comprehensive investigation, but instead was quietly buried. A freshman named Robert used amphetamines to manage an overwhelming course load his first semester. He'd been a stellar high school student, but found Stanford's competition brutal. The pills allowed him to keep pace with peers who seemed naturally brilliant. During finals week, Robert took massive doses trying to study for 3 exams in 2 days. His roommate found him dead in their dorm room, surrounded by textbooks and empty pill bottles. The coroner determined heart failure caused by acute amphetamine toxicity. Robert was 19 years old. Stanford's response was instructive. The death was reported as a tragic medical emergency without specifying the pharmaceutical cause. Robert's parents were told their son had died from a heart condition. Technically true but deliberately misleading. The university conducted no investigation of campus health center prescribing practices. No policies changed. The institutional calculation was cold and explicit. Acknowledging the amphetamine problem would invite lawsuits, regulatory scrutiny, and reputation damage far more costly than individual student deaths. Other universities witnessed similar tragedies and made identical calculations. Yale lost a student to suicide during amphetamine withdrawal in 1967. Princeton had a student suffer permanent brain damage from amphetamine-induced stroke at age 21. Columbia dealt with multiple students experiencing psychotic breaks, severe enough to require hospitalization. Each institution treated these as isolated incidents, rather than recognizing the systemic pharmaceutical addiction they were facilitating through their own health services. The medical literature remained complicit in the denial. Journal articles about student mental health avoided mentioning amphetamines as contributing factors to depression, anxiety, or psychosis. Research into stimulant addiction focused on illegal use of street drugs while ignoring prescription stimulants that doctors were distributing by the millions. This selective attention allowed the campus epidemic to continue unchecked. If the scientific literature didn't acknowledge the problem, administrators could claim ignorance. Pharmaceutical companies expanded their campus marketing throughout the decade. Representatives hosted luncheons for university physicians, emphasizing new formulations with supposedly improved safety profiles. They funded student health initiatives that conveniently included recommendations for stimulant prescriptions to manage academic stress. The companies had learned from their housewife marketing success that creating a medical framework around addiction made it socially acceptable and enormously profitable. Some students recognized the danger and tried to warn their peers. Underground campus newspapers published articles exposing amphetamine addiction patterns. Student health advocates distributed information about withdrawal symptoms and addiction risks. These efforts faced aggressive opposition from pharmaceutical companies that threatened legal action for spreading medical misinformation. Universities often sided with the companies, shutting down student publications that criticized campus health center prescribing practices. The generational tragedy was becoming clear to anyone willing to look. The 1930s had sacrificed one cohort of students to amphetamine addiction. The 1960s was sacrificing another, using the same drugs, the same marketing strategies, the same institutional denial. Pharmaceutical companies had refined their approach, but the fundamental business model remained unchanged. Create dependency in young people during their most vulnerable years, then profit from their addiction for decades. The students consuming these pills believed they were gaining competitive advantage. They were actually volunteering for lifelong chemical dependency that would cost them far more than they could imagine. By 1969, an estimated 15% of students at major universities had used prescription amphetamines for academic purposes. Perhaps 3% had developed full addiction. These numbers were never officially documented because no institution wanted to count. The casualties were everywhere. Students who dropped out, transferred, been hospitalized or died, but remained invisible in official statistics. The campus amphetamine epidemic of the 1960s would continue escalating until regulatory action finally forced change in the following decade. But by then, another generation had been sacrificed to pharmaceutical profits. The evidence was overwhelming by 1968. FDA officials had files containing thousands of reports documenting amphetamine addiction, psychosis, cardiovascular damage, and death. Internal agency memoranda acknowledged that prescription stimulants were causing a public health crisis. Researchers at Johns Hopkins had published comprehensive studies proving that amphetamines created severe physical and psychological dependency. The American Medical Association's own data showed emergency room admissions for stimulant-related complications had tripled since 1960. Yet the FDA continued allowing pharmaceutical companies to manufacture 8 billion tablets annually with minimal restrictions. The regulatory paralysis had a simple explanation: money and politics. Pharmaceutical companies had spent decades cultivating relationships with FDA officials, funding their conferences, offering lucrative post-government employment, and making substantial political contributions. Smith, Klein, and French alone generated over $100 million in annual revenue from amphetamine products. The company employed former FDA officials as consultants and lobbyists, who maintained close ties with current regulators. Any serious restriction on amphetamine production would cost the industry hundreds of millions in annual revenue. They fought accordingly. Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut recognized the crisis and convened hearings in 1965 examining amphetamine abuse. The testimony should have triggered immediate action. Dr. Sidney Cohen from UCLA presented evidence of widespread addiction among college students. Dr. John Griffith from Vanderbilt documented cases of amphetamine psychosis identical to paranoid schizophrenia. Dr. Everett Ellenwood from Duke described permanent brain damage in chronic users. The medical experts were unanimous. Amphetamines were devastatingly addictive and causing catastrophic harm. Pharmaceutical industry representatives presented a starkly different narrative. Executives testified that amphetamines were safe when used as prescribed, that addiction only occurred in individuals who abused the medication contrary to medical guidance, and that restricting access would harm millions of patients legitimately benefiting from treatment. They produced their own studies, funded by pharmaceutical companies, claiming minimal addiction risk. The contrast was stark: independent medical researchers versus industry-funded testimony designed to protect profits. The hearings revealed the scale of production that regulators had been permitting. In 1969 alone, American pharmaceutical companies manufactured over 10 billion amphetamine tablets. This quantity could supply 100 tablets to every adult in the United States. The excess production clearly exceeded any legitimate medical need, yet the FDA had approved these manufacturing quotas year after year. Agency officials struggled to explain this discrepancy under congressional questioning, offering vague justifications about market demands and medical necessity. Senator Dodd's investigators uncovered something more disturbing. Pharmaceutical companies were knowingly selling amphetamines to distributors that supplied illegal markets. Tens of millions of tablets disappeared annually into black market channels, and the companies maintained plausible deniability by not scrutinizing their distributors too carefully. A single pharmacy in Tijuana, Mexico, received shipments of 12 million dexedrine tablets in 1968, far more than any legitimate operation could dispense. The pills were smuggled back into the United States and sold illegally, but the pharmaceutical companies collected their profits regardless. The FDA finally proposed restrictions in 1968, suggesting that amphetamines be classified as controlled substances, requiring stricter prescribing and manufacturing oversight. The pharmaceutical industry mobilized a comprehensive lobbying campaign. Company representatives met with FDA officials, congressional leaders, and White House staff. They argued that restrictions would harm patients, burden doctors with unnecessary paperwork, and might even be unconstitutional. The proposed regulations were delayed, modified, weakened, and delayed again. Congress grew impatient with FDA inaction. The Controlled Substances Act passed in 1970, establishing Schedule II classification for amphetamines. This designation meant the drugs were recognized as having high abuse potential and addiction risk, requiring strict prescription controls and manufacturing quotas. The legislation should have dramatically reduced amphetamine distribution. Instead, prescribing patterns barely changed. Doctors simply documented their prescriptions more carefully to satisfy regulatory requirements, while continuing to write essentially the same number of scripts. The manufacturing quota system proved equally ineffective. The FDA was supposed to limit annual amphetamine production based on legitimate medical need. Pharmaceutical companies submitted requests estimating patient requirements, and the FDA generally approved these estimates with minimal scrutiny. The quotas remained high enough to supply the millions of Americans already dependent on the drugs, plus new users entering the market. Actual production in 1971 decreased only marginally compared to 1969 levels despite the new restrictions. One significant effect of the 1970 legislation was pushing some users toward illegal alternatives. Students and other recreational users who'd previously obtained amphetamines through prescriptions found access slightly more difficult. Underground laboratories filled this demand by manufacturing methamphetamine using relatively simple chemical processes. A basement lab could produce thousands of doses weekly using equipment purchased from scientific supply companies and precursor chemicals available through legitimate channels. The illegal methamphetamine industry exploded between 1970 and 1975. Motorcycle gangs in California recognized the profit potential and established sophisticated production and distribution networks. These organizations manufactured methamphetamine that was often purer than pharmaceutical products and sold it at lower prices than diverted prescription drugs. The FDA's restrictions on legal amphetamines had inadvertently created a thriving illegal market that was far more dangerous because it operated outside any regulatory oversight. Law enforcement struggled to contain this new threat. Methamphetamine labs were relatively easy to establish and difficult to detect. The precursor chemicals had legitimate industrial uses, making their purchase unremarkable. A single small lab could supply hundreds of users, so authorities needed to shut down dozens of operations just to make a dent in supply. Meanwhile, new labs appeared constantly as entrepreneurs recognized the extraordinary profit margins. The user base for illegal methamphetamine differed somewhat from prescription amphetamine consumers. Illegal meth attracted people who wanted intense highs rather than functional stimulation. They typically used larger doses, often injecting or smoking the drug for maximum effect. This pattern of use caused more dramatic addiction and health consequences. Emergency rooms began seeing patients with severe methamphetamine-induced psychosis, cardiovascular emergencies, and overdose complications that exceeded anything seen with prescription amphetamines. Pharmaceutical companies watched the illegal market expand and responded with cunning strategy. They recognized that amphetamine had developed negative connotations associated with addiction and abuse. The solution was rebranding, develop new stimulant medications that were chemically similar to amphetamines, but could be marketed as safer, more refined alternatives. Methylphenidate, marketed as Ritalin, had been available since 1954 but received increased promotion in the 1970s. The drug worked through essentially the same mechanism as amphetamines, but carried less historical baggage. Ciba Pharmaceutical Company, which manufactured Ritalin, launched aggressive marketing campaigns emphasizing the drug's use for children diagnosed with minimal brain dysfunction, a vague condition that would eventually be renamed attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The company positioned Ritalin as a treatment for a medical disorder rather than a simple stimulant, hoping to avoid the regulatory scrutiny affecting amphetamines. This framing proved brilliantly effective. Doctors who'd become cautious about prescribing dexedrine or benzedrine readily prescribed Ritalin, believing it represented a different class of medication entirely. The medical reality was that Ritalin and amphetamines were functionally equivalent. Both increased dopamine and norepinephrine levels through similar mechanisms. Both provided stimulation, focus enhancement, and appetite suppression. Both caused addiction in chronic users, but the marketing narrative successfully convinced doctors and patients that Ritalin was fundamentally different. Prescriptions for methylphenidate increased dramatically throughout the 1970s, while amphetamine prescriptions declined marginally. Users were simply switching from one stimulant to another. The FDA approved this obvious circumvention of their own restrictions. Agency officials recognized that Ritalin worked like amphetamines and caused similar problems, but the political pressure to allow pharmaceutical innovation outweighed concerns about abuse potential. The agency also faced a philosophical problem. If they acknowledged that Ritalin was functionally equivalent to amphetamines, they'd need to impose identical restrictions, which would mean admitting their existing controls were inadequate. Regulatory inertia favoured approving new drugs rather than confronting systematic failures. Some FDA officials attempted to sound alarms about the ongoing crisis. Dr. Robert DuPont, who served as the first director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, testified before Congress in 1972 that prescription stimulants represented a massive public health threat, requiring comprehensive action. He estimated that 10 million Americans had used prescription amphetamines or similar stimulants non-medically in the past year. DuPont recommended dramatic reductions in manufacturing quotas, stricter prescribing guidelines, and increased enforcement against diversion. His recommendations were largely ignored. The pharmaceutical industry had learned that regulatory capture was more effective than fighting regulations directly. Companies hired former FDA officials as executives and consultants, creating revolving door relationships that ensured friendly treatment. They funded research at prestigious universities that generated industry-favourable findings. They made substantial political contributions to congressional leaders who oversaw FDA appropriations. This comprehensive strategy ensured that even when regulations passed, enforcement remained lax, and loopholes stayed open. Academic medical centres became complicit in maintaining the system. Universities received millions in pharmaceutical research funding, creating financial incentives to avoid criticising drug companies too harshly. Medical schools trained new doctors using textbooks and materials heavily influenced by pharmaceutical marketing. The curriculum emphasised drug therapy as first-line treatment for many conditions, creating generations of physicians who reflexively prescribed medications rather than exploring alternative approaches. This institutional framework ensured continued demand for stimulants regardless of regulatory restrictions. The tragedy was that everyone involved understood the reality. FDA officials knew amphetamines were catastrophically addictive. Pharmaceutical executives knew their products destroyed lives. Doctors knew their patients were becoming dependent. Yet the system continued functioning because each participant had incentives to maintain the status quo. FDA officials wanted to avoid confrontation with powerful industry. Executives prioritized profits. Doctors took the path of least resistance. Patients believed they were receiving legitimate medical treatment. This alignment of interests sustained an epidemic that should have ended decades earlier. By 1975, the regulatory framework was complete, but effectively toothless. Amphetamines were Schedule II controlled substances subject to manufacturing quotas and prescription requirements. Yet doctors still wrote millions of prescriptions annually. Pharmaceutical companies still manufactured billions of tablets. Patients still became addicted at alarming rates. The illegal methamphetamine market had expanded dramatically. The FDA's deadly dance had achieved nothing substantive while allowing the pharmaceutical industry to maintain profitability and creating an even more dangerous illegal drug trade. The foundation was being laid for the next phase of the amphetamine epidemic. Pharmaceutical companies had learned they could circumvent restrictions by rebranding stimulants as treatments for newly defined disorders. The childhood diagnosis of hyperactivity, soon to become ADHD, represented an enormous untapped market. Parents desperate to help struggling children, teachers managing difficult classrooms, and doctors seeking simple solutions would drive explosive growth in stimulant prescriptions through the 1980s and beyond. The FDA had failed to stop the adult amphetamine epidemic. It would prove equally ineffective at preventing the pediatric version that would dwarf everything that came before. The rebirth of campus amphetamine addiction began quietly in 1996. Shire Pharmaceuticals launched Adderall, a combination of 4 different amphetamine salts marketed specifically for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The drug was chemically identical to stimulants that had destroyed previous generations, but packaging it as ADHD treatment gave it fresh legitimacy. Universities that had quietly discouraged stimulant prescriptions in the 1980s now faced aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, claiming ADHD affected up to 10% of college students who required medication to succeed academically. The diagnosis process was perfectly designed for abuse. ADHD symptoms, difficulty concentrating, restlessness, forgetfulness, procrastination, described essentially every college student experiencing normal academic stress. No objective test existed. Diagnosis relied entirely on self-reported symptoms and subjective clinical judgment. A student could walk into a campus health centre, claim they struggled to focus during lectures and frequently forgot assignments, and walk out 30 minutes later with a prescription for 60 Adderall tablets plus multiple refills. The first wave of strategic diagnosis occurred at competitive universities where academic pressure was most intense. A Columbia undergraduate named Jennifer discovered the system in 2003 after her roommate mentioned using Adderall. Jennifer researched ADHD diagnostic criteria online, memorized the symptoms, and scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist. She described textbook ADHD presentation, childhood difficulties in school, current problems maintaining attention, feeling overwhelmed by coursework. The psychiatrist prescribed 20 milligrams of Adderall daily without requesting academic records, childhood medical history, or second opinions from other providers. Jennifer's experience studying on Adderall felt revelatory. 6 hours passed like minutes. Dense philosophy texts became comprehensible. Essay writing flowed effortlessly instead of feeling like torture. She completed a week's worth of assignments in a single evening. The transformation seemed miraculous, proof that she'd been suffering from undiagnosed ADHD her entire life. She shared her success story with friends, carefully explaining the symptoms that secured her diagnosis. 5 classmates obtained their own prescriptions within the month using Jennifer's template. This pattern replicated across American universities with exponential growth. Students traded information about ADHD diagnostic criteria like insider trading tips. Online forums detailed exactly what symptoms to report, which doctors prescribed most readily, and how to respond to screening questions. Some students visited multiple providers to accumulate prescriptions from different sources. Campus health centers processed hundreds of ADHD evaluations monthly, without recognizing that the sudden surge in diagnoses represented systematic fraud rather than legitimate medical need. The pharmaceutical industry accelerated this trend through direct-to-consumer advertising that began in earnest around 2000. Shire's television commercials showed struggling students transforming into high achievers after ADHD diagnosis and treatment. Magazine advertisements featured testimonials from college graduates crediting Adderall for their academic success. The marketing deliberately blurred the line between treating a disorder and enhancing normal performance, suggesting that anyone who struggled academically might benefit from evaluation. Prescription rates exploded accordingly. In 2000, approximately 2.5 million Americans had prescriptions for ADHD stimulants. By 2005, that number exceeded 6 million. The demographic shift was revealing. While the medications were ostensibly for children with ADHD, the fastest growth occurred among college-age adults. Universities with 20,000 students might have 2,000 or more with active Adderall prescriptions by 2008. The statistical implausibility went unquestioned. Either ADHD rates had mysteriously skyrocketed, or students were gaming a diagnostic system designed to be permissive. The underground economy emerged inevitably. Students with prescriptions realized their pills had significant street value, especially during midterms and finals. A single 20 milligram Adderall tablet that cost perhaps 50 cents through insurance sold for $10 to $20 to classmates desperate for chemical assistance. Some students with prescriptions never took their medication personally, instead selling their entire monthly supply and pocketing $300 to $500. This side income helped pay tuition while supplying peers who couldn't or wouldn't obtain their own prescriptions. The dealing operated remarkably openly. Students solicited buyers through text messages and social media. Fraternities and dormitories had known suppliers who maintained regular inventory. During finals week, the campus market resembled a pharmaceutical bazaar, with dealers advertising their wares and negotiating prices based on demand. University administrators were aware. Campus police occasionally made token arrests, but the scale of distribution made comprehensive enforcement impossible. Stopping the trade would require arresting substantial percentages of the student body. Boston University experienced a dramatic example in 2009. Campus police executed a coordinated raid targeting students suspected of dealing prescription drugs. They arrested 47 undergraduates in a single day, seizing thousands of pills including substantial quantities of Adderall. The investigation revealed an organized network where students with prescriptions supplied dealers who distributed across campus and to neighboring schools. The operation had generated over $100,000 in revenue during the previous academic year. Every arrested student was maintaining good academic standing. Some were honor students. The scandal made national news briefly, then faded as universities returned to ignoring the obvious problem. The academic consequences proved devastating for heavy users. A University of Michigan sophomore named Marcus obtained an Adderall prescription legitimately in 2007 for mild concentration difficulties. He used the medication as prescribed initially, taking one pill before morning classes. The improvement felt substantial enough that Marcus began taking additional doses to maintain focus through afternoon and evening studying. Within 6 months, he was consuming 60 milligrams daily, triple his prescribed amount. He visited 3 different doctors to accumulate sufficient supply. Marcus's grades initially improved from a 2.8 to 3.4 GPA, but the tolerance cycle caught him as it catches all users. By his junior year, Marcus needed 80 milligrams just to attend lectures without falling asleep. His brain had adapted to constant stimulation by essentially shutting down normal arousal systems. He'd lost 30 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and exhibited paranoid behaviors his friends noticed but attributed to academic stress. When Marcus ran out of pills before finals week, the withdrawal hit catastrophically. He couldn't concentrate, missed 3 exams, and failed 2 courses. The university placed him on academic probation. Marcus recognized he'd become dependent and attempted to quit during summer break. The depression was total and overwhelming. Everything felt pointless. Getting out of bed required monumental effort. Basic tasks like showering or eating became nearly impossible. After 3 weeks of this hell, Marcus concluded he had severe depression requiring medication. He resumed Adderall use, believing it treated an underlying condition, rather than recognizing the drug had created his dysfunction. He graduated eventually but remained dependent on stimulants for years afterward, unable to function normally without daily doses. Yale documented an even more tragic case in 2011. A pre-med student named Sarah had maintained a perfect GPA through 3 years, using Adderall obtained through a combination of her own prescription and pills purchased from classmates. She'd been taking 100 milligrams daily for 18 months, a dose that would have seemed insane to users in the 1930s, but had become almost common by 2010. Sarah was studying for the MCAT when she experienced sudden cardiac arrest in the library. Other students performed CPR while paramedics were called. She survived but suffered permanent heart damage. Cardiologists determined that chronic amphetamine use had weakened her heart muscle and triggered a fatal arrhythmia. Sarah was 21 years old and would require medications and monitoring for the rest of her life. Her medical school applications were withdrawn. The medical establishment's response to these casualties remained disturbingly familiar. Doctors acknowledged that stimulant abuse caused serious problems, but emphasized that such outcomes resulted from misuse rather than appropriate medical treatment. The distinction was meaningless. The medications were inherently addictive regardless of whether use began with legitimate prescription or recreational experimentation. Yet maintaining this fiction allowed doctors to continue prescribing, while pharmaceutical companies continued manufacturing. Northwestern University Student Health Services conducted an internal review in 2010 after a student death was linked to Adderall use. The review found that 40% of students with ADHD prescriptions admitted to selling or giving away their medication. Nearly 60% reported using higher doses than prescribed. 30% had developed clear symptoms of dependency, inability to function without the medication, escalating doses, continued use despite negative consequences. The health services recommended stricter diagnostic criteria and prescription monitoring. The recommendations were never implemented because they would have required admitting years of negligent prescribing. The online pharmacy phenomenon added another dimension to the problem. Websites based overseas offered to prescribe and ship ADHD medications after brief online consultations that were transparently fraudulent. A student could complete a 10-minute questionnaire, pay with a credit card, and receive shipments of Adderall or generic amphetamines within weeks. These operations existed in legal grey zones, technically illegal, but difficult to prosecute across international borders. The FDA shut down dozens of these sites yearly, but new ones appeared constantly. A Harvard Law School student named David used online pharmacies to obtain Adderall when his legitimate prescription proved insufficient for his escalating use. He'd been taking prescribed medication since his second year, but needed increasingly large amounts to maintain focus through the brutal workload. Online sources provided unlimited quantities without questions. David was consuming 120 milligrams daily by his third year, enough to keep him wired for 16-hour study sessions, but also enough to induce severe paranoia. He became convinced that professors were conspiring to fail him, that his exam answers were being altered, that other students were stealing his notes. David's paranoia escalated into criminal behavior. He began forging prescriptions, using stolen prescription pads from university health services to obtain Adderall from multiple pharmacies. The scheme worked for 6 months until a pharmacist noticed inconsistencies and contacted authorities. David was arrested for prescription fraud and drug trafficking. The quantity of pills he'd obtained qualified for distribution charges, even though he'd consumed most personally. Harvard expelled him before graduation. The state bar rejected his application for character and fitness reasons. A brilliant legal career ended before it began, destroyed by the same pills he'd believed would ensure his success. The statistics by 2012 revealed the scope of the disaster. Over 10 million Americans had prescriptions for ADHD stimulants, with the demographic heavily skewed toward college-age adults. Studies estimated that 30% of college students had used prescription stimulants non-medically at least once. Perhaps 10% were regular users, and maybe 3% had progressed to full addiction. These numbers meant that on a campus of 30,000 students, roughly 1,000 were struggling with stimulant dependency, while administrators and health providers maintained willful ignorance. Emergency room visits for complications related to prescription stimulants tripled between 2005 and 2011. Patients presented with cardiovascular emergencies, acute psychosis, seizures from mixing stimulants with other drugs, and overdoses from taking massive doses trying to achieve effects that tolerance had eliminated. Most were young, previously healthy individuals whose only risk factor was taking medication that doctors had prescribed or that they'd obtained from peers using prescriptions. The medical system was creating casualties, treating the complications, then sending patients back into the same pharmaceutical pipeline that had destroyed their health initially. The cycle had repeated perfectly. The 1930s sacrificed students to Benzedrine. The 1960s sacrificed another generation to Dexedrine. The 2000s sacrificed a third cohort to Adderall. The drugs were chemically identical. The marketing strategies were refinements of approaches developed 80 years earlier. The academic pressures that made the pills appealing hadn't changed. The addiction mechanisms worked exactly the same as they always had. Yet somehow each generation convinced itself that their pharmaceutical stimulants were different, safer, more controlled than the versions that destroyed their predecessors. This collective delusion ensured the epidemic would continue indefinitely, with pharmaceutical companies profiting from each new wave of users who believed they could control substances that were designed to be uncontrollable. The brain damage reveals itself slowly, accumulating invisibly until the deficit becomes undeniable. A former college student named Thomas had used Adderall heavily between 2005 and 2009, maintaining what he believed was controlled use during his undergraduate years. He graduated, stopped taking the medication, and resumed what he assumed would be normal life. By 2015, at age 32, Thomas noticed something profoundly wrong. Tasks requiring sustained concentration, reading reports, analysing data, following complex conversations, exhausted him rapidly. He'd been a voracious reader before college, but now struggled to finish articles. Simple pleasures like music or good food felt muted, as though his emotional range had been permanently compressed. Thomas visited neurologists seeking explanations. MRI scans showed no obvious structural damage. Blood tests revealed nothing abnormal. Cognitive testing placed him in normal ranges, though he knew his current performance represented catastrophic decline from his pre-amphetamine baseline. The doctors had no framework for understanding his condition, because medical literature barely acknowledged that chronic stimulant use caused lasting neurological changes. They diagnosed depression and prescribed SSRIs that provided no benefit. Thomas was left managing profound cognitive disability that the medical establishment refused to recognize as real. The neurological research told a different story than what doctors learned in medical school. Studies using advanced imaging techniques showed that chronic amphetamine use caused measurable changes in dopamine receptor density, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and striatum, regions governing executive function and reward processing. Users who'd taken stimulants daily for years exhibited receptor profiles similar to Parkinson's patients. Their brains had adapted to artificial dopamine floods by reducing both receptor quantity and sensitivity, changes that persisted years after drug cessation. Former users described the consequences in devastatingly consistent terms. Nothing felt genuinely pleasurable anymore. Accomplishments that should bring satisfaction felt hollow. Relationships lacked emotional depth. Life existed in perpetual grayscale, drained of the vibrancy that normal humans experienced. Some reported that this anhedonia, the clinical term for inability to feel pleasure, improved marginally over years, but most never fully recovered their pre-drug emotional range. They'd permanently traded peak experiences during addiction for flattened effect that would last their remaining decades. The aging addicts from the 1950s and 1960s reveal the full trajectory. A woman named Eleanor had used Dexedrine as a housewife starting in 1954. She'd become addicted, suffered multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, and finally achieved sobriety in 1972 after years of struggle. In 2015, at age 83, Eleanor reflected on what the pills had cost her. She'd lost 2 decades to addiction and its aftermath. Her marriage had ended. Her children remained estranged. The cognitive impairment she'd experienced after quitting had never fully resolved. She struggled with memory and concentration into old age far beyond normal decline. Most painful was the emotional emptiness that had persisted for over 40 years since her last dose. A veteran named Frank had used military-issued Benzedrine during World War II, then continued with prescription amphetamines for decades afterward. He'd been dependent for 50 years before finally quitting in 1995 at age 71. Frank lived another 20 years, dying in 2015, and reported that he never felt normal again after stopping. Depression shadowed his entire post-amphetamine existence. Simple daily activities required willpower that other people seemed to possess naturally. He'd won his battle against addiction, but lost the war for a fulfilling life. The drugs had extracted payment that extended across his entire lifespan. The medical literature from 2010 onward began acknowledging what users had known for decades. Longitudinal studies following former amphetamine users for 10+ years documented persistent cognitive deficits, increased rates of depression, elevated risk of Parkinson's disease, and premature cognitive decline resembling early-stage dementia. The dose-response relationship was clear. Heavier use over longer periods caused more severe lasting damage. But even relatively modest use, the standard ADHD prescription of 20 milligrams daily for 2 years, produced measurable changes in brain structure and function that didn't fully reverse. The current generation of users remained largely unaware of these long-term consequences. A college student taking Adderall in 2020 had access to far more information than her 1960s counterpart, but pharmaceutical marketing and medical minimization of risks effectively obscured the danger. Prescription information sheets listed potential side effects, but described them as rare and easily managed. Doctors emphasizing the benefits of treatment for ADHD rarely mentioned that the medication might permanently alter brain chemistry. Students trading pills convinced themselves that temporary use for academic purposes carried minimal risk. The quit attempts revealed addiction's grip with brutal consistency. A Georgetown student named Alex decided to stop using Adderall after graduation in 2018. He'd been taking the medication for 4 years and assumed that ending use would be straightforward once academic pressure disappeared. The withdrawal destroyed that assumption within 72 hours. Alex experienced depression so severe he couldn't leave his apartment. Sleep came in 16-hour blocks that left him more exhausted. Concentration was impossible. Watching television required too much focus. After 2 weeks, Alex concluded he was experiencing major depressive disorder requiring treatment. He resumed Adderall use and remained dependent 5 years later. The pattern repeated endlessly across the country. Users who attempted to quit encountered withdrawal symptoms so severe they seemed like evidence of underlying mental illness rather than drug-induced dysfunction. Doctors reinforced this misperception by diagnosing depression or anxiety when patients reported post-cessation symptoms, then often prescribing the same stimulants as treatment. The medical establishment had created a perfect trap: drugs that caused the problems they claimed to treat, ensuring permanent dependency masked as ongoing medical necessity. Some users managed to quit but paid catastrophic prices. A former Stanford student named Rachel stopped using Adderall in 2016 after recognizing she'd become addicted. The withdrawal lasted 6 months of profound disability. She lost her job because she couldn't function adequately. Her relationships deteriorated because she lacked energy for social interaction. The depression was so severe she required psychiatric hospitalization to prevent suicide. Rachel eventually recovered enough to resume semi-normal life, but 2 years post-cessation she still struggled with concentration, motivation, and emotional regulation. Her brain had been permanently altered by 4 years of daily stimulant use during college. The children represented a particularly tragic dimension. By 2015, over 3 million children under age 18 had prescriptions for ADHD stimulants. Many began taking these medications as young as 6 years old. The long-term consequences for developing brains remained largely unstudied because conducting controlled research on children was ethically fraught. But the logical implications were terrifying. If adults who used amphetamines for a few years suffered lasting damage, children who took them throughout their developmental years might face even more severe consequences that would only become apparent decades later. A child named Daniel received an Adderall prescription at age 7 in 2005 for classroom behavior problems. He took the medication daily for 12 years through high school graduation. Daniel was never given the opportunity to develop natural focus, emotional regulation, or coping strategies. The pills handled everything. At 19, attempting to transition to college, he tried stopping the medication. The result was complete functional collapse. Daniel couldn't attend classes, manage basic self-care, or handle any stress without experiencing overwhelming anxiety. He resumed medication, recognizing that he'd been chemically dependent since early childhood and lacked the neurological infrastructure to function without it. The medical establishment maintained its position that appropriately prescribed stimulants represented safe, effective treatment. The American Academy of Pediatrics published guidelines recommending medication as first-line treatment for ADHD in children as young as 6. These recommendations relied heavily on research funded by pharmaceutical companies showing benefits from treatment while minimizing addiction risks and long-term consequences. Independent research suggesting caution about medicating developing brains received far less attention. The financial incentives all pointed toward continued prescribing. Pharmaceutical companies celebrated record profits throughout the 2010s. Shire was acquired in 2018 for $62 billion, with Adderall revenue representing a substantial portion of the company's value. The acquisition price reflected investors' confidence that stimulant prescriptions would continue growing indefinitely. Indeed, prescription rates showed no signs of declining. By 2020, over 16 million Americans had active ADHD medication prescriptions. The market had expanded far beyond the company's most optimistic projections from the 1990s. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated prescribing through telemedicine. Online psychiatry services offered ADHD evaluations and prescriptions through video consultations that were even more permissive than in-person visits. A patient could schedule an appointment, complete a brief questionnaire, speak with a provider for 15 minutes, and receive an Adderall prescription, all without leaving home. Some services completed the entire process in under an hour. The convenience attracted new users who'd never previously considered medication. Prescription rates spiked 20% in 2020 alone. The telehealth companies operated with virtually no oversight. Cerebral, a prominent online mental health service, was investigated in 2022 for prescribing controlled substances so readily that it functioned as a de facto drug-dealing operation. Internal company documents revealed that providers were pressured to prescribe stimulants to maximize revenue. Patients who were clearly drug-seeking received prescriptions without question. The company's business model depended on creating long-term customers through dependency. Federal investigations eventually forced some restrictions, but dozens of similar services continued operating without modification. The emergency room data told the story that pharmaceutical marketing obscured. Stimulant-related ER visits reached 30,000 annually by 2019, triple the rate from a decade earlier. Young adults in their 20s represented the largest demographic. Common presentations included chest pain from cardiac stress, severe anxiety or panic attacks, psychotic episodes with paranoid delusions, seizures from mixing stimulants with other substances, and overdoses from taking massive doses. Every patient represented a failure of the medical system that had prescribed or enabled access to addictive drugs, while minimizing the dangers. The cardiovascular damage became increasingly well documented. Studies following stimulant users longitudinally showed significantly elevated rates of hypertension, arrhythmias, and premature heart disease. A 2020 analysis found that young adults taking ADHD medications had double the risk of sudden cardiac arrest compared to non-users. The mechanism was straightforward. Chronic stimulation stressed the cardiovascular system continuously, causing cumulative damage that manifested years later. Users in their 20s dismissed chest palpitations and elevated heart rate as minor side effects. Those same users face serious cardiac complications in their 30s and 40s. Former users in their 30s and 40s during the 2020s confronted a devastating realization. They'd used amphetamines to succeed academically and professionally, believing the benefits justified temporary risks. Now they faced permanent consequences: cognitive impairment, emotional flattening, increased disease risk, and potential early mortality. The successful careers they'd built felt hollow when they couldn't fully experience or enjoy them. The medications had extracted payment in a currency they hadn't understood they were spending: their long-term neurological and physical health. The generational cycle showed no signs of breaking. Students in 2025 faced the same academic pressures as their 1935 counterparts. Pharmaceutical companies marketed the same drugs using refined messaging. Doctors prescribed with the same casual permissiveness. Universities maintained the same willful ignorance. Each generation convinced itself that their situation was different, that they could control substances that 90 years of evidence proved were uncontrollable. The infrastructure of addiction, manufacturing, prescribing, distributing, rationalizing, functioned as smoothly as it had for nearly a century. The final dark irony was that everyone involved had learned precisely the wrong lessons. Pharmaceutical companies learned that addiction was profitable. Regulators learned that industry capture prevented meaningful oversight. Doctors learned that prescribing was easier than difficult conversations about lifestyle, study habits, or stress management. Students learned that chemical shortcuts seemed effective until the bill came due. Society learned to accept mass pharmaceutical dependency as normal medical treatment rather than recognizing it as an epidemic that had been engineered for profit. The pills that promised to unlock human potential had instead created generations of users who would spend their lives managing the consequences of temporary chemical enhancement. The focus they'd bought in their 20s cost them cognitive function in their 40s. The energy they'd gained as students left them depleted as adults. The confidence the drugs provided masked the reality that they were volunteering for permanent neurological alteration, and the cycle continued, with new users making the same calculation their great-grandparents had made, convinced that their experience would somehow be different. The amphetamine epidemic that began in 1933 never ended. It simply evolved and expanded, ensuring that pharmaceutical companies could profit from human ambition and desperation indefinitely.